This is an incredible moment. The future is here.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion, Reimagining Landscapes. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet in all of the different lands that people may be joining from today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Thanks also to Bush Heritage Australia, who've helped us bring this event to you today. My name is Tamara Davis, and I'm your host for tonight. I'm an astrophysicist at the University of Queensland, and as such, I study cosmology. So I study the universe as a whole, the biggest landscape there is, really. I was really touched by the film that comes along with this panel discussion, The Echoes of the Invisible. It touches on many sort of different themes that are important to me. It considers not just the landscapes as the traditional way we consider landscapes, the sort of vistas on Earth, but also the human landscape of the amazing people living on this amazing planet, and the temporal landscape of the history of the Earth and the ancient beings that have lived and still live on it. And then it goes further still and considers the deep history that we can watch through light from space. Now, one of the things I loved about the film was it encourages us to connect with our surroundings, especially the people around us. And it left me feeling quite peaceful and refreshed. So if you haven't watched it yet, I definitely encourage you to set the time aside to go and do so. Now, one thing the film does really well is bring together a diverse array of characters with a common theme, just like our panel here today. So without further ado, let me introduce the stars of our show. So with us today, we have Karlie Noon, a fellow astrophysicist and an Aboriginal woman. Karlie's not only studied the cosmos, but also spends her time ensuring that significant Aboriginal and cultural sites are put on the National Heritage List. We also here have James Bradley. James is a prize-winning writer whose books through fiction help people connect with environmental issues, which I think is such an important way to get people to understand and act on some of the issues that our climate is facing. Now, completing the panel, we have Richard Geddes. He's the National Fire Program Manager at Bush Heritage Australia. And I know he has some amazing stories about working with Aboriginal people and their deep knowledge of the land to help mitigate fire risks. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And if I was in a room with all of you at the moment, I'd ask you to give a virtual round of applause to our panel. So if you're at home listening, imagine that you're giving a round of applause to welcome these wonderful people to our virtual stage here. Okay, to kick us off, let's get you guys to introduce yourselves, because you'll do a much better job than I have just done. So how about we start with Richard?
Yeah, thanks, Tamara, and hi everyone. Yeah, real pleasure to be on the panel, and thanks for the invitation. I work for Bush Heritage Australia. It had a humble beginnings, Bush Heritage Australia, back in Tasmania almost 30 years ago, with a small purchase of land to protect some unique conservation values. And since then, over the 30 years, we've expanded our reach right across the country. We've got over 36 reserves for conservation and to look after cultural heritage values around the country. But also we have really significant partnerships with Aboriginal people right across Australia, and in particular in Cape York and Arnhem Land and the Kimberley and the Western Desert, and I might touch on that a bit later. My role with Bush Heritage is to try to prevent bushfires on our reserves and in our partnership areas, and that can involve a lot of things, but I've been really privileged to work with lots of different Aboriginal groups over the years, not just with Bush Heritage in the last few years, but stretching back over the last 20 years or so. I was in the Western Deserts of Western Australia, in the little sandy desert, a couple of years ago with one of our partnerships with the Madu people there on the Birriliburu Indigenous Protected Area. It was an amazing experience. We were out on top of this rocky escarpment one day, looking out over the vast rolling spinifex dunes, and this old man standing next to me, he said, "See that tree over there? I was born under that tree 60 years ago." And then in the 1970s, when I was a kid, we saw these trucks in the distance, and they came over to see the fires that we were lighting. That was actually the first time that non-Aboriginal people had seen that Madu clan, and that obviously led to a huge change in those people's lifestyles, and they went back to communities. But the old man that day was talking about how his knowledge of the country is just such an incredible connection to his country. And one of the things that's really important to them is when we are looking after the country through fire by creating small patchy fires in the cool season, we're looking for seasonal indicators. And in the case of the Western Desert, it's the stars, it's the constellations as they move across the sky, and when the constellations get to a certain part of the sky, they know that that's the time for the cool season burning. Similarly, in the Kimberley where I work, there's really important seasonal indicators. There's a yellow flower that grows on the banks of the Fitzroy River in the central Kimberley where we work with the Bunuba people, and that yellow flower tells us when to start burning. And funny enough, that yellow flower is a Sesbania plant. The stems can be actually used to rub together and to make fire as well. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is tapping into that deep understanding and ecological knowledge over time, and marrying it with space technology, with using GPS and geographic information systems, and bringing the two together to really empower Aboriginal people to look after vast landscapes over millions of hectares. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone.
Amazing. That sounds like some amazing stuff. And I, as an astronomer, of course, I love the link between the Aboriginal knowledge and the stars. And I'm sure Karlie does too. Would you like to give us an introduction to yourself, Karlie?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tamara. So my name is Karlie Noon. I am a Camilleri woman. I was born and raised in Tamworth, New South Wales, kind of near Armidale, if you haven't heard of that place. It's the country music capital of Australia, so I would be shocked if you haven't heard of it. So I guess, aside from being an Aboriginal woman, I spend a lot of time talking about science, learning about science. My main interests are definitely astrophysics. Within that, I like looking at the Milky Way, gas dynamics of the Milky Way, and also other spiral galaxies. On top of that, and what kind of introduced me to astronomy and astrophysics in the first place was really the sky knowledge that is within Gamilaraay culture and every mob's culture across Australia and the Torres Straits. It was really, once I had finished kind of learning about physics and maths, and that was my first passion, maths, and that kind of led me to physics. And once I kind of had a grasping on those subjects, particularly physics, I found that I was able to gain a much different understanding of a lot of our stories, a lot of our traditions, and so much of that knowledge just became available to me simply because I had a better understanding of how the world works and how weather works and how our atmosphere works. So it was actually going back to my community and to my culture that led me down this fascination of, how do things up there work? How does our galaxy work? So yeah, on top of that, I spend a lot of time and have for the past 2 years working in Indigenous heritage. That has a lot of different features of it, and is obviously incredibly important work that we're trying to do there. There's a few different ways that it happens, but essentially at the end of the day, we're trying to get significant Indigenous places protected. And protected from various things, whether it be mining or development or whatever it is. So yeah, my job is really trying to get an understanding of what sites there are in Australia, what communities want, what sites they want put forward, and really supporting them in that, and trying to get different places listed. So yeah, that's probably enough of me talking about myself. I'll pass it back to you, Tamara.
Amazing. I'm looking forward to diving into some of those topics a bit more as this discussion progresses. James, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a novelist and I'm a writer. I write both fiction and non-fiction. I over the last maybe 10 or 12 years, a lot of my work's been about climate and about the environment. I've written 2 novels recently, one called Clade, one called Ghost Species, both which are in different ways about questions to do with climate and I guess kind of making space for change, thinking about how we live in a climate changed world. But I've written a lot of nonfiction as well. So I've written a lot of nonfiction, both which is kind of nature writing, so it's kind of talking around a series of questions to do with animals and trying to make a series of kind of connections, I think also with a series of questions about time and space and landscape, and also about other things. I've just, in fact, published a piece a couple of weeks ago, which was about a lot of the kind of stuff about collapse that's around at the moment, these kind of collapsology, the stuff that purports to be a kind of study of civilizational collapse and its kind of imminence. So yeah, I mean, I've written a lot around those kinds of questions about the environment, about climate, about kind of trying to make space for kind of politics within that, about how we think about it, about how we experience it. And a lot of it's kind of working in a kind of speculative mode as well. So it's trying to use kind of the tools of science fiction to try and imagine what those changed worlds might be like.
Fascinating stuff. You just reminded me of a quote, I think it was from Frank Herbert, who said that science fiction is not necessarily about predicting the future, but warning against it.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, and that is certainly one of the kind of things that science fiction does. I mean, the problem, and I'm not sure that I think of what I write as science fiction necessarily, but one of the things that science fiction gives us is a series of tools for kind of imagining worlds which are different from our own, and a series of kind of techniques for thinking about our relationships to those worlds, which kind of push us into new spaces. So absolutely. But I mean, I think a lot of the climate writing at the moment is very much about trying to warn us about a world that we don't want to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really interested in that stuff myself. And one thing that I found frustrating as a scientist was the seeming inability sometimes to communicate some of the aspects of things like climate change or scientific aspects that need some sort of political clout or action, and the sort of failure of logical arguments. And I couldn't understand how people can't see what seems so obvious to me. And the use of stories to get people to understand issues, I think, is a really important way. And I certainly, I guess, in many cultures, the oral history that people pass on from generation to generation is a way of getting across scientific knowledge and ideas through stories. I know that's something that the Aboriginal people in Australia did for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, just jump in there.
No, please.
Yeah, I guess the difference between purely oral culture and a culture that is aware of written technology and printed technology, and obviously now information technology, the way that information is transmitted are so vastly different. If you say something, for example, that kind of insinuates that someone is hearing what is being said, and that in itself affects what knowledge is transferred, right? That person can argue it, or that person can add to it, or that person can look at it differently, whereas if we compare that to the written text, it's purely in this static form. There is no interaction with it. It's just there. And so, this leads to two vastly different knowledge systems. But what I find really interesting about that is, at the end of the day, we are looking at the same systems. We are looking at the same world. So despite the differences between, these two different ways of transmitting knowledge, the knowledge itself is pretty similar.
Mm-hmm. Richard, I know you've had, you said you were spending a lot of time sort of using the traditional knowledge of the land and to learn or to utilize the kinds of knowledge that we didn't yet have as when you started doing some of the things that you were doing.
Yeah, that's right. It's essential. We have these small windows of time every year where there's the perfect conditions to do small patchy cultural burns. So these small patchy cultural burns done normally in a cooler season, in winter or in autumn, normally not long after rainfall. But there's all these cues in the environment if you know how to read the country, to actually coincide with the timing of that burning. And as I mentioned, the Bunuba people in the Kimberley have this yellow flower that comes into bloom in March, and that'll change from year to year. It might be late March one year, it might be early April the year after, and that's the beauty of it, is that it's in sync with the natural rhythms of the land. There's no point having summer being the 1st of December. It's sometimes it's earlier, sometimes it's later. Summers are always different, but the cue from the environment is actually the same each year. It's just a different timing. So I guess one of the amazing things that really inspired me many years ago was spending time in Arnhem Land with some elder people with incredible knowledge of the country. And you might be able to see this photo behind me. I can point to it just there, but it's a sort of iconic place near Kakadu on the Arnhem Land Plateau. And the Arnhem Land Plateau, that rock there, you might be able to see, that sandstone rock is 1,700 million years old, so 1.7 billion years old. So it's been standing there as an island as the sea levels have risen and fluctuated over millions of years. But the Aboriginal people in that part of Arnhem Land showed me some paintings in the caves in the gorge there, and those paintings are actually previous to the last ice age. So over 10,000 years ago, there's some images of boomerangs when boomerangs were actually effective in that type of environment. It was a lot drier, a lot open, a lot less rainfall, and you could throw a boomerang quite easily. If you were to throw a boomerang in that environment right now, it'd hit a tree about 5 meters away because there's been a big change since the last ice age. Sea levels went up again, and they sort of stabilised, and the landscape is a lot closer to what we see today. But in those galleries, in those rock art galleries, you've got paintings from the last ice age which depict those boomerangs and other activities, and then the art actually changes, and then it actually shows that the sea levels rose, and as the sea levels rose, all those plains in Kakadu and off the sandstone escarpment there, they got inundated with salt water, and all the barramundi and all the estuarine and marine animals came up with the salt water, and the Aboriginal people recorded that. And then around about 2,000 years ago or so, the mangroves and the sea levels stabilised and the fresh water came in. And that's actually common right throughout Australia. If you look at the coast from Darwin all the way around to Queensland, New South Wales and Vic, you've got the story there. And one of the cues in the environment there is on the coastal floodplains, wherever you normally see paperbark trees, melaleuca trees, a lot of them are being cleared from history, but in those coastal floodplains, you will have freshwater sediment on top, and normally with paperbark trees. A lot of areas it's been cleared and drained. Under that freshwater mud, if you like, or freshwater sediment, you've got the mangrove mud from about 5,000, 6,000 years ago when those sea levels were higher. And that's okay. If you leave it undisturbed, it's not a problem. But if you disturb that freshwater layer and you expose that old mangrove mud, you actually turn the whole floodplain acidic, like battery acid acidic. And it's this phenomenon called acid sulfate soil that we didn't even know nothing about until about the year 2000, when some scientists in the university near here on the Northern Rivers actually discovered it. But it's a worldwide problem, and it's a direct thing of climate change, and we didn't even know about it until 20 years ago. I probably could go on about it, but the Aboriginal story of survival and all of the climate changing is such a big story, and it's maybe it's something that we're going to learn as the climate changes in the future.
It's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Because I mean, Karlie was talking about the difference between oral traditions and written traditions, and the assumption is always that written traditions are more stable because there's a kind of, there is a written record of things. But I mean, you look at particularly Australia, and lots of the kind of Indigenous groups have got stories talking about what was there before the end of the last ice age. So you've got this kind of quite stable, highly detailed record of things that are now under the water, of what happened when the water came up. There's no record like that anywhere in the written records. Yep. all of those, and obviously it's longer ago than writing, but I mean, every other culture has lost it, so that's deeply fascinating to me, that you see the oral culture is actually a more stable form of connection to the past than the written culture in that instance.
And if you ever go to Darwin, and straight off Darwin City, there's the harbour there, and I know some of the Larrakia traditional owners quite well there, and they've you can't quite see it, but I've got a painting of this songline, the dugong songline, and it's exactly what you're talking about. There's these sacred sites that are underwater in Darwin Harbour, depicting the dugong songline, and there's songlines underwater right across the coast of Northern Australia, which obviously inundated now, but at once upon a time, years ago, they were exposed dry land. So yeah, it's an amazing concept.
But I grew up in South Australia, and the two big gulfs down there, the Spencer and St Vincent's Gulf, both only filled up at the end of the last ice age, and before that they were kind of low plains. I think some of them were kind of wetlands and things, but they filled up. But there are stories amongst the traditional owners down there which describe all of these features down in Backstairs Passage, which tell them where there are springs under the water. It's extraordinary, and they know where all of that stuff is.
Mm-hmm.
To touch on something that you were talking about, James, the survivability of it, for me that really comes back to the adaptability of an oral culture and an oral tradition. I think, Richard, you really inadvertently made a really good analogy when you were talking about the seasons. In our modern society way, we have 4 seasons, and it's this time of the year is one season and this time of the year, and it's the same every year. It's so rigid, and it doesn't have that flexibility that you have when you're actually your knowledge is informed, right? When it's informed by these signifiers, whatever it is, it's informed by the world around us, where at one stage, those 4 seasons, it was certainly informed, and it certainly is informed, but to only a certain degree, and to only within one period of time, right? Unless we're going back and we're changing that every year, that method just doesn't work. If we're just saying, okay, no, there's 4, that's it. So yeah, for me, it's really about the adaptation, and yeah, how adaptable an oral society can be, as opposed to written material.
I guess you wouldn't hear someone saying, "Poor, it's so hot already, and it's not even summer." That's probably a nonsensical idea if you're judging whether it's summer or not by the heat.
Well, it would be, the alternative would be, oh, it's so hot yet, and Pallades isn't even out yet.
Yeah, I guess that's yeah. Interesting. I was interested about that idea of the oral tradition and how long some stories have lasted. There's the one point that in the film where there's someone who journeys by foot around the world, basically, and they are taking some photos of these ancient carvings that they've found along the way, and noting that these things have lasted tens of thousands of years, and the image on the camera that is stored in electrons, and that's not even going to last 20 years. And the comment that he makes in the film is that we're the ones that are the ghosts. But I guess there's a difference there, that we are looking at some sort of written tradition in terms of the artworks that are on the rocks as well, and some of the I guess what people will see of us in the future probably won't be my Facebook page. More likely to be the crumbled apartment building that I used to live in. Yeah, but I guess in cities we get very divorced from the land and understanding the things like the seasons, and even just understanding the importance of stars to different cultures. If you've grown up in a city, you don't see the stars generally. Like you've got to see them as tiny little pinpoints of light. You go out I went out into to a telescope with some of my students recently, and a lot of them were just like amazed. They go, wow, I've never seen the Milky Way this bright. I've never been able to see the shadow of the emu across the Milky Way, and these different things, because you just don't experience. You don't have that connection.
Yeah, I was the opposite. I think when I first went to the big city, which my first big city was Newcastle, that's when I realized, I guess, the connection I had to the sky. Growing up in Tamworth and outskirts Tamworth as well, you just don't think about that. You just always have access to the sky. It's always beautiful and glorious, and you just don't think about it. But then as soon as I lost it, I was like, damn, how do I get this back? I literally just have to go back into the country to get it back. So yeah, it wasn't really till I lost it that I was like, I had something.
I remember having what was a really embarrassing realization as an astronomer. I went, one of the first times I was observing at a big telescope, I was out at Sliding Springs, which is the middle of New South Wales, and the telescope looked like it should be working, but no images were coming through. And so I walked outside and I was looking at why there's stars everywhere in the sky, but there's no stars at this patch directly where our telescope is looking. That's really weird. Why are there no stars in that patch of the sky? And then I had the realization that clouds are black at night. Having grown up in a city, you always see the city lights reflected off clouds, and I'd always
They're
see
orange.
clouds of white at night, and so when the clouds were in the way, it's black. And I was just like, oh, I probably shouldn't admit this in something that's going online. But yeah, that was one of my sort of embarrassing moments as becoming a professional astronomer.
Relatable. One thing I wanted to touch on, just before we move on to something else, not the act of speaking itself, that is something that kind of spoken about that, but you bring up rock art and engravings, and an oral culture is not just speaking. It's it's art, and it's dancing, and it's song, and it's all these things combined. And I think what really separates it, say something like a rock engraving, or like a beeswax rock art or something like that, is that it's integrated into the nature, right? It's integrated into the environment. Whereas we look at how we live today, and there's very few things that we can say where we're integrating ourselves and our lives and our lifestyle into nature. That just really doesn't happen. And so I think that's a really key difference, also in terms of its survivability. But the other thing on top of that, when you have these communities where and societies where there is so much value placed on the art, on the dance, on the songs, and the tradition has to become fluid. Tradition has to change. Tradition is not a static thing. Tradition is always changing, and always growing with that community and with that society and with the environment around it. So yeah, I think there was a really nice link there between not just the oral cultures being this adaptable thing, but it comes down into the tradition as well, and that very much applies to to us today as Aboriginal people and Indigenous people. I think that's very important to remember.
You bring up the idea of time as well, and that's something that I'd love to touch on, and all of the different perspectives of time that people have. One of the themes in the movie was the time and the deep history that you can see both in history of the landscapes on Earth and out in space, but also the linking of technology and landscapes. And many of the vast desolate landscapes are places where we do have things like telescopes that look out into the cosmos. Yeah, so it would be interesting to touch on those different aspects of time. Before we do, though, I just wanted to mention to the people online that if you have any questions for the panel, please start typing them into the chat. We're going to answer some questions towards the end, and happy to dive into things that you guys might be interested in. Yeah, so I know, Richard, you were talking about using, combining GPS with traditional Aboriginal knowledge and getting the two sort of working together. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's such a fundamental thing, and I guess a few of the viewers and others are aware, but there's been a big land rights movement across Australia, and particularly over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot of land given back under the Land Rights Act and the Northern Territory and Native Title Act around the country. And so what's that has meant to Aboriginal people is it's offered an opportunity to not only get back on the country for the first time in generations, but also set up ranger programs and start looking after the country from the threat of really big bushfires, weeds, feral animals, all that sort of thing. And I was talking about the Birralaburu Indigenous protected area in the Western Desert of WA. The country that they look after is actually 60,000 square kilometres, so over 6 million hectares. And the problem they have is that there's a map in the old people's heads. It's like they're an eagle. They've been up there and they can see the landscape and it's in their memory just intrinsically. But the younger generations haven't grown up in the desert or the bush, so there's a disconnect there. So how do we facilitate that incredible knowledge over vast landscapes in a way that younger generations can tap into it and then build on it and pass it down themselves. So yeah, talking to the old people, getting all that incredible knowledge of the country, of the seasonal indicators, of the song lines, of the way that fire behaves in different landscapes, and then using GPS units, even mobile phones, because every mobile phone has a GPS in it, and we can create these maps from tapping into the satellites. You know, there's these NASA satellites going over every few hours, and they'll actually record any fires across all of Australia every few hours. So we've got this building data set, this layer and layer of years and years of fire history, which the satellites are recording, and then we put those onto these big visual maps, all sort of colour coded, so that the old people, even though they might not have the best English or best language, because often English is a third or fourth language, but they can see the map because it's like an eagle eye view, and they can see all the different colours as fire has moved across the landscape in different years. And then they'll start populating that map with all the cultural knowledge. So at the end of the day, we have this incredible map which has been drawn all over with sacred sites and rock art sites and fire-sensitive cypress pine areas and the whole lot. And then we put that onto their mobile phone, and they can actually go anywhere in a vehicle or on foot or in the helicopter and look onto the map, and they'll have all that info right there in their hand. And it's without that, they just would not be able to manage that 60,000 square kilometres. So yeah, it's such a powerful tool to enable Aboriginal people to look after country, and such a profound experience when, you know, with these sort of experiences, we're often going to places that people haven't been to in generations, and the younger generations have never been there. So there's often tears, there's often really incredible emotions. So it's a real privilege to sort of marry these two, you know, the traditional knowledge with the space technology, and technology is only going to get better, isn't it? So it's, yeah, it's great.
I love the interconnectedness of everything, because one of the practical applications of I study things like black holes, and so one of the practical applications we talk about from studying black holes is GPS, because you actually need general relativity, theory of gravity, to explain or to get all the positions right when you've got satellites in a different gravitational field and moving quickly and stuff like that to get accurate positions. And so I love those kind of. I was studying this obscure black hole thing over here, and all of a sudden it has this application on Earth.
Yeah.
I was in the Cocos Islands with a group of scientists working using remote. They do remote sensing work, and they were using drones to do assessments of plastic at the beginning of the year. In fact, just as the pandemic rolled in. And one of the things they were doing was complementing the work they were doing with drones by using satellite images being taken by the International Space Station. And so we were standing on this beach, which they were getting photos taken of from space in the Cocos Islands, which is out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And then you go to Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, and there's a description of the beach we were standing on that you can read there, where he's describing this beach. And I remember this kind of amazing moment where you're going, this is marrying of the kind of this extraordinary scientific voyage kind of 200 years ago and this thing up in space. But simultaneously, you're looking at it and you're going, or am I just looking at two different versions of the kind of colonial gaze being brought to bear on this place? You know, there was a kind of there's a really fascinating kind of duality in that to me, but that kind of meshing of this kind of incredible high technology and knowing that you can read this account from 200 years ago of someone, you know, of Darwin standing there and looking at this particular beach, you know.
We've got a couple of questions from online. Maybe we should dive in and answer a couple of those. I noticed there's one that's a question about time. I read that there was no word in any Aboriginal language to refer to time as we do. How do you think that could affect the way of understanding of the sky and the stars? Any thoughts? Is that true? What's the words for time in the Aboriginal language?
I don't know if I wouldn't want to say that's absolutely true. Yeah. I have no idea. I have not, tried to do a comprehensive search of the word time. What I would add to that is the concept of time is different. From my experience, it's not, this past, present, future kind of separateness. It's, the past and the present are kind of now. And, you know, this is obviously going to be very different across this, you know, all the different, you know, amazing mobs and communities we have. So I really want to stress that this is general and this is definitely my experience alone. But yeah, it's kind of like I think that there's a English term that is used to describe kind of Aboriginal time, and that is everywhen. So I think that that's a nice way to describe it. I don't really want to add too much more to that
I love that
descriptor.
concept.
Yeah, it's
Everywhen.
a different way to look at things, and I think it definitely puts a lot more agency on the now, for me anyway, because it's, you know, not only are you worried about the now, you're also worried about the back then and the, you know, looking forward. You know, it's kind of all of that is within kind of your hands now. So yeah, I think it's a very different way of looking at things. I think for me it's you know, if we're talking about how you know, concepts like this, or different approaches, you know, like Indigenous approaches to things, you know, how that can how that can affect our understanding of things, you know, whether we're talking about the universe or stars or literally anything. I think it can only benefit from you know, anything can only benefit from looking at something through a different lens, and the more different that lens is, the more weird that is and more foreign that is, I think the better outcomes, the more knowledge we can gain, and the more holistic understanding of things we get. So yeah, I'm absolutely all for trying to integrate Indigenous approaches and values to, you know, how we do life today.
Yeah. One of my favorite mind-bending things that I learned from Aboriginal astronomy was that in sort of the Greek Roman type cultures, we would make constellations out of the stars, the bright points of the sky, whereas the Aboriginal people sometimes make the constellations out of the dark patches where the shadows are. And that was, when I first heard that was mind blowing. And I was like, that is such a cool way and such a different perspective that I had never been exposed to. And it makes you think like, okay, what perspectives am I missing? I love that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely how I kind of think of it as well. And I've said this in the past, you know, my I guess goal, you know, the purpose of why I study science and, you know, try to understand these topics is because I want to understand our world and the universe that we're in. And to do that, you know, any way of looking at that is going to help me be a better astronomer, be a better scientist. So I think, you know, the same applies to literally most things that I can think of. And, you know, I feel incredibly privileged that I'm in this space where I did grow up on country. I did grow up with, you know, connection to my community, that I'm able to, yeah, I guess have this appreciation.
So there's a couple of other questions that have come in about science fiction. So there's actually a whole bunch here. That Carly, Richard, and Tamara, do you read science fiction? Is there and can we recommend any sci-fi books? But also, maybe James can start by answering this. What's the potential of science fiction and fictional stories in mapping out futures and potential ways forwards, especially at times like this?
I think that's a really interesting question. Let me answer it to begin with by suggesting that if people are looking for books to read, the one I'd read at the moment is the new Kim Stanley Robinson novel, which is called The Ministry for the Future, which is, I think, it's a kind of extraordinary book, but it's an attempt to try to, I mean, Robinson's really Kim Stanley Robinson's incredibly interesting because he's a kind of utopian writer. So what he's trying to do is to imagine, you know, kind of a world that might work. And this is about how do we get from here to there. It's not about once we're there, it's about what might the process of trying to get through the next 50 years look like, and how might we manage that. And it's a really interesting book, which is engaged with a whole series of questions, and some of them are questions like, what's the role of political violence in that process? So it's a really powerful, challenging book, which is in a weird kind of way like a manifesto for what you might want to do, which I think is really, really interesting. But look, I do think there is a kind of place for that. One of the things, I kind of came to writing in this space, writing fiction in this space, because one of the things I kept finding was that when I tried to imagine what a climate change world was like, I stopped, like my mind just shut down. You'd kind of go, look, what's 3 degrees look like? What's that feel like? What's that like, does society fall over? And I couldn't answer any of those questions for myself. So I started trying to write fiction, which kind of moved us into that space to see how it worked, and it was about trying to make some kind of, I guess, effective sense of it, to kind of communicate both to myself and to readers what it might feel like to live in that world. But it was also about just trying to think about what it might be like. Well, what's going to happen, and it seems to me there's something quite interesting there, because one of the things that I think we do is when we think about the future, and I think this has a lot to do with kind of climate, I think it has a lot to do with kind of living in capitalism. I think it's got a lot to do with a whole series of things like that. It's that wonderful line of Frederick Jameson's about it being easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But we end up in this situation, what we do is we imagine the end of the world. So we kind of imagine either it's going to go on like this forever, but worse, or everything's going to fall over and we're all going to be roaming the landscape, eating each other, and it seems, but if you think about it, they're the kind of two kind of tropes we have to think about the future these days. And it seems to me that one of the things you can do with this kind of fiction is move yourself into a space where you say, so probably neither of those extremes is going to happen. Things will be different. Things will change. And to go back to that question of time, one of the things that starts happening is once you start thinking about big spaces of time, what you begin to see that all of the things that we think of as permanent today, our kind of social arrangements, our economic arrangements, our, the kind of shape of our society, you realize that they're completely contingent. You realize that they can change. And that seems to me to create a kind of space for kind of political possibility. There's something about realizing that the world can change that breaks us out of that mindset where we think nothing can change. And so, I do think there's a kind of space for science fiction and for that kind of writing that's working in that speculative way to do some of that stuff.
That's why I love science fiction, because it can be very philosophical and it can break you out of your ordinary assumptions that you take for granted and put you in a different scenario that's not necessarily challenging to your everyday things, but gives you, hold on a second, that's a very different perspective. That's one of the reasons I love it.
Yeah, and that process of estranging people from the world is one thing that science fiction does really well. And we do it by saying, what would happen if we lived in a kind of fundamentalist theocracy, which is kind of the idea of something like The Handmaid's Tale. So what you do is you take one aspect of the world and you kind of amplify it. Yeah. And suddenly it forces you to see our world differently. It's a very powerful conceptual tool, Yeah,
absolutely. You mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson, who also is one of my favorite science fiction writers, and I remember reading his Mars series some time ago, which is fantastic. And it was interesting because it was very scientific. It attacks things in a quite scientific way about what it might be like to go and possibly colonize Mars, and accurate sort of gives you sort of durations. Like, people go to Mars not expecting to change things in a generation or even two, before they could make Mars livable. It takes a long time. And that concept of time and not thinking of, my lifetime or the next election cycle or whatever's happening tomorrow, and thinking in many generations is, I think, actually really important for us in our present day if we want to think, particularly on the topic of climate change.
Yeah, I found that's one of the disconnects that I've experienced the most. Something you mentioned, Tamara, at the start, how when you're talking with people about things that are happening, sciencey things, whether it's like climate change or, you know, phosphine on the moon or on Venus or whatever it is, you know, logic doesn't seem to prevail. And I think that really, like, what I've noticed is that the idea of time and the ownership of time as well. So, you know, my time and your time and, you know, mum's time and dad's time, that's really different for people. And so, for example, like, I know, you know, some parents, I've heard some reactions be like, well, climate change isn't going to be something that I have to deal with in my lifetime, full well knowing that it's something their children have to deal with, but being able to disconnect themselves from that, that's something that I just kind of find baffling. And also that I think, yeah, for me, it's the ownership and how we very much value ownership of things, and particularly material things, and how that's kind of transcended into time, my time and your lifetime and, you know, your future lifetime. So yeah, it's very depressing. Sorry.
Yeah, I find I would almost call it a selfish perspective there, of like not being able to think beyond your own little bubble. And I think those stories help us get there. I love the quote, we read to know we're not alone. Can't remember where that came from, but it sticks there, to find common ground. Okay, so questions are coming in thick and fast. Let's have a quick look. I misspoke before as well. If anyone has any good climate fiction as opposed to science fiction, then speak up and let everybody know. So there's a few different questions about how we can, so going from science fiction and ideas to how we can connect people with solid sustainability understanding, and also potentially linking that with an Indigenous perspective. And there was a question a bit earlier about how we might better educate future citizens in the way of Indigenous people. But yeah, and another question of what kind of landscape do you imagine we'll be living in year 3000? So a few of those are linked questions. So any thoughts?
I might make a comment there. One of the things that Bush Heritage does and a lot of other organisations is trying to record a lot of this cultural knowledge, but record it in media which can be spread anywhere through the internet, through video and etc. And I'm just wondering the potential of technologies and virtual reality for those people in urban areas and cities where they are disconnected from nature, and they don't have that connection, which will hopefully give them responsibility for climate change. So how do you bridge that gap? And I can imagine lots of opportunities for people that are in the cities to be able to enter virtual reality where there's an old Aboriginal person sitting on the banks of the Fitzroy River talking about what his generation, hundreds of generations of his ancestors have done and how they've looked after country. And from experiencing myself in the flesh, I just know how profound it is. And I think as technology improves, we'll be able to immerse ourselves in virtual reality and hopefully get some of that connection to country back amongst people that are less connected.
I think there's a real role for storytelling of different kinds, and for it's interesting. I've just read the David Attenborough book that goes with the special he's just done. And one of the things that's really fascinating about it is that it's a really inspiring book, because what it does is it does a whole series of things at once, but having, I think, made very clear to people how bad things are, it offers a series of a kind of roadmap for how to fix it. And I actually think somehow empowering people with ideas that will allow them to see that there are alternatives and ways of fixing it is actually more powerful than just terrifying people. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I mean, there's something about actually, saying, so, people need to get to grips with the scale of the problem. And I think that's really difficult for people. And I think it's really paralyzing. I think it's terrifying for people when they get there. But part of what has to happen then is you have to actually say, so what do you do with that now? Where do you go from here? And you know, I mean, as I said, I just read the Attenborough book. I, in fact, just read Tim Flannery's new book, which I think does a really good job of that in a kind of Australian perspective about trying to look at what some of the kind of institutional solutions might be to some of these problems, which I think is a really interesting thing, you know, and kind of moving away from just kind of broad declarations to actually kind of nuts and bolts, like what might you actually do? You know, what might that solution look like at a kind of political level? And I think that kind of conversation is incredibly important. You know, I mean, I think there's a real tendency for us to go, we can't save the world without ending capitalism. You know, that seems to me to be a pretty tall order to do in the next 5 years, you know, but, you know, I think it's probably right. But, you know, there are kind of things we can do towards that goal. There are things we can do to re-empower people. There are things we can do to kind of, you know, stop what's going on now, and finding that kind of roadmap, I think, is very important.
Because there are solutions available, and I'm curious as to why climate change has become such a partisan issue. Or I mean, it's been for a long time now, but why can't we all come together? And you know, the science seems clear to me. So
vast amounts of money. That's why we can't come together.
Once it became a political issue, then it's bipartisan and it's gone.
Oh, and look, I think something's happened also about it becoming constitutive to kind of right-wing identity, which is a problem. But I mean, one of the things you see quite clearly in Australia is that, you know, you have an absolute connection between a kind of captured political system, which has been captured by the fossil fuel industry, and the kind of political things that are coming out of that system. And to go back to what I was saying before, you know, there's kind of low-hanging fruit. We could, you know, get rid of political donations and lobbyists tomorrow, you know, and that would do a great deal towards kind of rationalising our climate policies. Do you know what I mean? So, I mean, it's that kind of thing about, you know, there's actually kind of discrete things we can do right now. You know, we can stop cutting down trees. You know, it's like, you know, so, I mean, it is, I think that's interesting. Trying to find those practical things that you can kind of focus on is one of the ways of empowering people, I think.
Yeah. And we need to get people to feel not threatened by the concept of change, and confident that they're going to be able to adapt to whatever change comes.
Yes. Or perhaps more threatened by climate change than by the concept of the change they need to go through.
Policy change or identity change. Yeah.
Okay, so we never answered the one of what kind of landscape we imagine that we'll be living in the year 3000. Do you want to venture a speculation?
I would like to think that we would be living in a beautiful fusion of sustainable practices, but still having available to us the, you know, amazing technologies that we use and love today that make our lives convenient and a lot easier. That's my utopia.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of technologies in there to mitigate all the climate change at the moment, in terms of reducing energy use, reducing land use for agriculture. I think, James, you were talking about how easy it is to make milk when we were talking about before, but there's all these, as you say, there's all these solutions at our fingertips now. It's just the political will to actually make it happen. So yeah, I'm pretty confident as well, but I guess we'll see. Maybe we won't see our
I probably won't see
generations will.
Yeah.
No, I aim to be around in the year 3000.
Yeah.
It's part of the vision.
I guess I'm optimistic too that we will have to deal with things by then. We'll either be in dire straits or we'll have figured it out. So fingers crossed.
We'll probably have a whole bunch of new problems.
Yeah. Okay, we're running out of time.
Sorry, just hopefully less stressful than climate change.
So we're running out of time. We only have a little bit of time left, but there's a few more, another couple of questions. We might just take one or two. So one question was, how can our tools and knowledge systems help us understand and prepare for the fires, which seem unprecedented and changing with climate change?
Yeah, well, I guess one thing that we can do straight away is improve access to these the technology, the satellites that are actually recording the fires every few hours. Like that access to that technology is only in the northern half of Australia. For the rest of Australia, the average person can't go onto the internet and see what the fires have done over the last 20, 30 years. So that's a no-brainer, and the technology's there, the funding should be there, and hopefully out of this Royal Commission we'll see that happen. But as I said, there's so many technologies that are just waiting to get the green light in terms of political will and funding. So I guess that'll be my comment. Thanks.
I think for me, it really comes back to how we treat our water and how we as a society manage our water. I think it's, this is coming from someone who grew up in drought for their entire childhood. But there was a period of time when I was very young where drought wasn't a thing. I didn't know what drought was. We had green grass. Every house had green grass. And then, as I got older, drought was definitely a thing and started to become more severe and severe. And I was in Tamworth at the start of this year, and they were approaching 0% water in their catchment, the dam. So I think it's really about recognizing that water is our blood. That is our bloodline. That is our survival, and just having access, to water in these completely arid places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So let's go for one final question, and then I'll get to see if anyone has any final thoughts before we wrap up. So the final question I think we have here is that although landscape often refers to a natural place outside of the city, are there productive ways around thinking about city and bush outside of the sort of binary dual thinking?
I would say definitely yes. The way that I try and do that in my day-to-day life is literally just making things happen, bringing things to me how I can. So, being surrounded by plants inside and outside and taking care of them and watering them, trying to find ways that you can break that binary down, and not being afraid of going outside, because I know people are. I have so many friends who I go camping. I love camping. I'm a crazy camper, but then I meet friends who are terrified of camping, and I completely understand that. I totally do. There are spooky things out there as well, like spiders and stuff, so I completely understand that. But actively trying to engage with that fear and trying to minimize it, and not be afraid of dirt and not be afraid of these things, because look, we all come from it, and we're made up of it. So just trying to get that connection back.
Yeah, I think Brisbane's a pretty good example of where because it's such a big local council there. I think it's one of the biggest in Australia, but it's the entire city, and what that's allowed them to do is actually to make really good decisions across the landscape. And one legacy of that is that there's incredible bush and parkland all through Brisbane, and some pretty good biodiversity as well. So if you take the time to actually do that land use planning, design our cities so that there is good green spaces and corridors for animals, then you can make a huge difference. And I think Australia is probably leading the way in some cases, but it's certainly something you can do in many other cities. And I guess particularly as food production, the technology of it, we can produce a lot of things in warehouses now that we don't need these huge spaces of land. So the interface between the city and the bush, if you like, is often with farmland. So all of a sudden we might have all this land that we can plant up again and cool the climate down and create better biodiversity. So the solutions are there.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the cities, one of the things you really see is that we need, all of the research shows that we do better when we're around natural system. All of the research shows that we, being around trees and plants and animals and birds makes us better people. But also, the single most effective technology for cooling cities is trees. So I mean, we need to start bringing that stuff into the cities. We need to start designing and re-engineering our cities so it's there. I saw a thing recently with these a group of architects down in Melbourne. I think they're at RMIT, and they've designed all of these special bricks, basically, and they're like breeze blocks, I think, that you can put into the structure of buildings as you're building them, which then create the nesting hollows that different kinds of birds use. So when you build a block of apartments, you put, you say, well, we're going to put, 20 pardalote nests here. We're going to put, you can actually kind of design the birds into the building. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and realise that the city itself is a type of landscape. And I would also answer by saying that one of the things that we started with, that there's a human landscape, and there's the community and the cultures and the connections that we can make with people, and fostering that when there's such an opportunity to do so, rather than being in our own little boxes, is a fantastic aspect as well. Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time, I think, so we should probably wrap up here. Does anyone have any final last words they would like to express?
I'll jump in. Just bouncing from what you were just saying, Tamara, connecting with people. I would really encourage people, and I'm going to take this advice myself, encourage to engage with those people who maybe do feel, maybe do seem a little bit disconnected. Maybe they are a little bit scared to try and, embed themselves in our natural environment, and try and help them with that. Or maybe if you're one of those people, maybe try and ask for help with that, in a gentle way, and bring our friends along with us.
Yeah, I think just allowing yourself to have time to reconnect to nature, to get out bush, turn your mobile phone off, your social media off, let time slow down and start to get into the actual sync of nature, because it gives you such well-being, and that well-being can be transferred onto other people as well. So it's just allowing you that opportunity and time to reconnect is it's a really important reminder in everyone's very busy lives. So just take the time to give yourself that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd say that we're heading into some scary times, and it's community that keeps people alive, that looks after us, and the same thing.
Amazing. Well, thank you, all three of you, Karlie, James, and Richard. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks also to everybody online who's been watching. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And as I said, go and check out the film that goes along with this, The Echoes of the Invisible, because it really is quite interesting. Final thanks to Bush Heritage Australia and the other sponsors who've helped this film festival go ahead. And with that, we'll call it a day. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See ya.